I have watched men I admired turn to water at the sound of a hammer cocking. I have watched preachers run and gamblers pray, and one good sheriff freeze up so hard you could have leaned a ladder on him. So when I tell you that the bravest thing I ever saw on this earth was done by a woman with a busted lip and one shoe missing, I need you to understand I am not a man who hands out the word brave like penny candy. I've spent it careful my whole life. I've buried friends who earned it, and I've watched cowards die loud and get it carved on their stones by mistake. This is the one time I'd carve it deep. This is the one I keep coming back to, the way your tongue keeps finding the gap where a tooth used to be. Her name was Itza. The men at the way station never bothered to learn it. By the time they wanted to, she'd already done the thing that made them ashamed they hadn't asked. So before you go thinking you know how this ends, a damsel, a rescue, a cowboy riding tall, let me stop you right there. Nobody rescued her. She did the rescuing, and the man she pulled out of the fire was me. The first thing I remember is the dust coming up off the floorboards in a little puff every time the bandit kicked. That sounds like a strange thing to fix on. A man's dying and you're watching the dust. But that's how the mind works when it's gone past being scared and out the other side into that flat, ringing quiet. I was sitting with my back against the cold iron of the stove and a hole in me the size of a thumb, just under the collarbone, and I remember thinking, clear as church bells, somebody ought to sweep this floor. The somebody, as it turned out, was not going to be me. Let me back up. My name's Eli Cobb, and at the time of this telling I was 44 years old and feeling every mile of it. I'd been pushing a string of horses up from the Pecos country for a rancher named Dryden who paid late and complained early, and I'd stopped at the Cottonwood crossing station to water the stock and buy a meal that wasn't beans for once in my miserable life. The station was a low adobe thing with a sod roof, run by a Dutchman named Voss and his wife, who I never did get the name of because she didn't talk to drovers and I didn't blame her. There was a stage due through. There usually was. That's why the man came. He came at dusk, which is the cowardly hour, the hour when the light lies to you and a fellow on a horse could be a friend or a debt collector or the angel of death, and you can't tell which until he's close enough to smell. This one smelled like a man who hadn't washed since the war, whichever war it was. He had a scattergun across his saddle and a face that had given up on being a face and settled for being a warning. He called himself, when he bothered to call himself anything, Tuck. We found out later it wasn't his name. Names weren't a thing he wasted on people he meant to leave behind him. There were 6 of us inside when he came through the door. Voss and his wife, a whiskey drummer named Pell who'd been talking my ear off about the future of the rye trade, a young soldier on leave, a boy really, maybe 19, with his collar still creased from somebody's iron, me, and the woman. I'd noticed her the way you notice weather coming. She'd come in off the morning stage and the stage had broke a wheel, and so she was stuck same as the rest of us, waiting on a part that hadn't come. Apache. Voss's wife had said it under her breath like a curse, Apache, and made her eat at the end of the bench by herself, and the woman had taken her plate to the far end without a word, like she'd expected exactly that and had stopped being surprised by it a long time ago. She wore a man's wool coat too big for her and her hair in a single black rope down her back, and she had a way of sitting very still that I took, at first, for meekness. I have been wrong about a great many things. I was never so wrong as that. When Tuck came through the door, he didn't say this is a robbery because he didn't have to. The scattergun said it. He swung it slow around the room, taking the measure of us, deciding in that quick animal way which of us was the danger and which was the meat. He landed on the soldier boy, naturally. Uniform. He landed on me second because I was wearing a gun, an old Navy Colt I kept more for snakes than men. And he dismissed the rest of the room with a flick of his eyes. The fat drummer, the old Dutchman, the 2 women, the way you'd wave off flies. That was his mistake. I wanted understood here at the start that everything that went wrong for that man went wrong because of one assumption he made in the doorway in the bad light, and the assumption was this, that the dangerous ones were the men. "Coats off," Tuck said. "Pockets out. Anybody puts a hand somewhere I don't like, I'll paint the wall with him." The drummer, Pell, started babbling. "Some men do that. He had a wife in St. Louis," he said. "He had a sample case, take the case. It was all samples, good rye, take it." And Tuck hit him across the mouth with the gun barrel, casual, the way you'd swat a dog off the table. And Pell sat down hard on the floor with his hands over his face and made a sound I won't try to spell. The soldier boy was reaching for something. I saw it, and Tuck saw it the same instant. The boy had a little pepperbox pistol in his waistband, and his hand was creeping toward it, and his face had gone the color of tallow. And I thought, "Don't, son, don't. You'll get us all killed." And I was opening my mouth to say it when the boy went ahead and did it anyway. He was fast. He was just fast at the wrong thing, which is to say he was fast at dying. The pepperbox came up and never got level. Tuck's scattergun took him in the chest at 6 feet, and the room went white and deaf, and the boy was just gone, is the only way to say it. A creased collar and a mother somewhere, and then a red ruin against the wall. And the smell of it, that hot copper and sulfur stink, filling up the little room like water filling a boot. That's when I drew. I'm not proud of how it went. My hand had already started before my brain caught up, which is the only reason it started at all, because if I'd had a full second to think about that scattergun's second barrel, I'd have kept my hand exactly where it was. I cleared leather. I even got a shot off. It went into the ceiling, into the sod, and brought down a little rain of dirt. And Tuck swung the gun, and the second barrel caught me high on the left side and spun me into the stove, and that, friends, is how I came to be sitting on the floor watching the dust, with a hole under my collarbone and my own gun 3 feet away where I dropped it, useless as a dropped hat. I want to be honest about what I felt. People always want the dying part to be noble. It wasn't. I felt cheated. I had a low, mean, childish thought, clear as anything, and the thought was, this isn't fair. I didn't even do anything. 44 years, and the last thing in my head was a tantrum. And over all of it, the dust, coming up in little puffs off the boards. Tuck broke the gun and thumbed in 2 fresh shells. He was in no hurry now. The room was his. 3 men down or sitting, Pell still curled on the floor with his bleeding mouth, the boy dead, me leaking against the stove, and Voss frozen behind his counter with his hands flat on the wood like a man who'd been told not to move and intended to follow that instruction unto the grave, and the 2 women. Mrs. Voss had backed into the corner by the meal safe, and had both fists pressed against her own breastbone, and was praying in Dutch, fast and quiet, the same handful of words over and over. The Apache woman, Itza, had not moved at all. I could see her from where I lay sidelong, my cheek half against the cold iron. She was still sitting at the end of the bench, still with that terrible stillness I'd mistaken for meekness. But I could see her eyes now, and there was nothing meek in them. She was watching Tuck the way I'd seen a cougar watch a picket line, not afraid, not frozen, just measuring, counting something, waiting on a number to come up right. Tuck noticed her about then. He always did notice the wrong things last. "You," he said, "Injun, come here." She stood up, slow, that too big wool coat hanging off her like a tent. She came around the end of the bench and into the open floor, and she did it with her head down and her shoulders rounded, and her hands held out a little from her sides, palms showing, and oh, she sold it beautiful. She walked toward that man like the broken thing he'd already decided she was. I watched her do it, and even I believed it, and I was the only one in the room with a clear sightline to her eyes, and her eyes were doing something altogether different than the rest of her. Her eyes had already killed him. The rest of her was just walking up to break the news. "There's a pretty," Tuck said, and grinned, and that was the last expression that man ever put on his face that he meant. Here is the part I have told maybe 4 times in 20 years, and never twice the same, because the truth of it goes too fast to hold. She got within reach. Tuck had the scattergun in his right hand, low, not pointed at anything in particular, the way a man holds a tool he's done needing for the moment. He reached for her with his left, to grab her by the coat, by the hair, I don't know, by whatever a man like that reaches for. And in the half-second his left hand was out and his right hand was lazy. She stopped selling it. I have tried for years to describe how fast it was, and I have never managed, and I won't insult it now by pretending. She didn't grab the gun. That's the thing nobody believes. A lesser fighter grabs for the gun and gets shot for it. She grabbed his wrist, the right one, the gun hand, and she did something to it, twisted it down and back against the joint the way it doesn't want to go. And the scattergun went off into the floor and blew a hole in the boards big enough to lose a cat in. And in the same motion, she brought her knee up into him and her free hand had come out of that big wool coat with a knife in it. Not a fighting knife, a cooking knife, Voss's wife's paring knife, the little one off the meal bench that she must have palmed an hour before any of this started, when she was sitting quiet at the end of the table being a woman nobody learned the name of. She'd been ready an hour. She'd been ready since the door opened. She'd been ready, I came to understand, her whole life, the way you get ready when the world has spent 30 years teaching you that no one is coming to help. The knife went in under his arm where the ribs leave off, and she didn't stab and pull back the way a frightened person does. She drove it and stayed, leaned her whole 110 pounds into the heel of that little knife, her face 6 inches from his, and she said something to him I couldn't hear. 3 words, maybe 4. In Apache, I think, though I never asked and she never said. And whatever it was, Tuck heard it. I saw it land in his eyes. Whatever she said to him in that last second was the truest thing anybody ever told that man, and he died knowing it. He went down. He went down enormous and loud, the way big men do, and the scattergun clattered off under the bench, and the little adobe room was suddenly full of the absence of him, that ringing nothing that comes after, and the dust, God, the dust, coming up off the boards where he fell. And then it was quiet, and the woman they wouldn't sit next to stood in the middle of the floor with a paring knife in her fist and the dead man's blood on the cuff of that big wool coat, breathing hard through her nose, looking down at him and not at any of us. Not yet. She'd see us later. Right then she was looking at the thing she'd just done, the way you look at a fire you've put out with your bare hands, knowing it was necessary and knowing it's going to scar all the same. I made a sound. I think I said help, or maybe just made the noise a man makes when the pain catches back up with him after the fright lets go of it. The hole under my collarbone had been keeping quiet during the excitement, and now it remembered its job, and I felt the warm spread of myself down inside my own shirt, and the edges of the room went soft and gray. She turned. She looked at me, the gun-wearing fool who'd cleared leather just in time to shoot the ceiling and get himself ruined, and I waited to see contempt in it. I'd have deserved it. I'd done nothing but make things worse. The boy was dead because nobody'd thought fast enough, me least of all, with my snake gun and my 44 years and my big ideas about being the dangerous one in the room. There wasn't contempt. There wasn't pity either, which I'd have hated worse. She crossed the floor and knelt down beside me and pulled my shirt open with hands that didn't shake even a little. Mine were jumping like a man with the palsy. And she looked at the hole and pressed 2 fingers around it hard, and I yelped. And she said the first thing I ever heard her say in English, which was, "You will not die from this. That's all, you will not die from this." Like a sentence handed down. Like she'd looked at the books and added it up, and that was simply the figure she'd arrived at, and the matter was closed. And here is a thing I didn't understand until much later. She wasn't comforting me. Comfort would have been a lie, and she didn't deal in those. She just decided it. She'd looked at the wound and looked at me and decided I was going to live. And then she set about making her own decision come true, calling sharp at the frozen Dutchman for clean cloth and the hot water off the stove, getting Mrs. Voss to stop praying long enough to be useful, packing the wound with a folded rag and her whole weight behind it, while I cussed her in 3 languages and one I made up. Pell the drummer crawled over at some point, his mouth still bleeding, and started thanking her. Thank you, oh God, thank you. And she didn't even look up from my collarbone. She just said flat, Bring the lamp closer. He brought the lamp closer. And I lay there bleeding on a dirty floor next to a dead boy and a dead bandit. And I watched a woman that a whole room of us had decided wasn't worth a name run that room like a field hospital. And I felt something break open in me that had nothing to do with the hole in my chest. Shame, partly. But under the shame, coming up slow like water in a dug well, something cleaner. Something I didn't have a word for yet at 44 years old, which is a sorry age to be learning a thing that simple. The word, when I finally found it, was respect. But it was bigger than the way men usually use that word, bigger than tipping your hat, bigger than the grudging nod you give a fellow who outshoots you. It was the kind of respect that rearranges the furniture in a man. The kind you don't recover from. The kind that, 20 years on, still makes me set down whatever I'm holding when her name comes up, because some names you don't hold things during. She got the bleeding stopped. I won't pretend I remember it clean. I was going in and out, and the parts I do remember have the slippery quality of a thing dreamed. But I remember her telling Voss to send a rider for the doctor at Sweetwater, and I remember Voss saying it was 12 miles in the dark, and the woman saying then he had better start now, and I remember Voss starting now. And I remember, this last bit clearer than anything, I remember coming up out of the grave for a moment and finding her still there beside me, sitting back on her heels, finally letting herself be tired. The fight was over. The deciding was done. And in that one unguarded minute, with no one looking at her but a half-dead drover she had no reason to perform for, I watched the woman who just killed a man without her hands shaking start, very quietly to shake. Just her hands, just a little. She looked at them like they belonged to someone else. Then she folded them together in her lap hard, the way you'd hold down a bird, and made them stop. And she caught me watching her do it. I thought she'd be angry to be seen like that. I'd have been. She wasn't. She just looked at me for a long moment with those measuring eyes, and something in them softened by exactly 1 degree, the way ice gives up its first drop. And she said, quiet only to me, the way you'd tell a secret to a man you've decided to let live. It is allowed to be afraid after. I have thought about that sentence for 20 years. It is allowed to be afraid after, not before. Before she'd had work to do. But after when the room was safe and the boy was dead and the man was down and the only thing left to feel was the feeling. After she let her hands shake and she let me see it and she told me it was allowed. I didn't know her name yet. I'd learn it that night when the fever was on me and she'd tell me to hold on to something and I'd ask, stupid with pain, hold on to what, and she'd say my name then and tell it to me. Itza. I'd hold on to it. I'm holding on to it still. But that's the next part of the telling, and I find I have to stop here a minute. Some things you can't ride straight through. You have to make camp partway and sit with them. The dust had settled by then. Somebody finally swept that floor. Fever is a liar, and the worst of it is, it lies in your own voice. By full dark I was deep in it. The hole under my collarbone had quit bleeding the way Itza decided it would, but the wound had its own opinion, and its opinion was heat. It came up through me like a grass fire works up a hillside, slow at the bottom edge, then a rush, then the whole of me crackling. I'd been cold on that floor an hour before. Cold as the stove iron at my back. Now I was a furnace, and the room kept tilting like a flatboat in a current, and the lamp Pell held had grown a soft yellow halo a foot wide. I remember asking somebody if the boy was still dead. That's the kind of question a fever asks. Still dead, like there was a chance he'd reconsidered. Nobody answered me. The boy was where he'd fallen, under a horse blanket they'd laid over him, and the toe of one army boot stuck out the bottom of it, polished, and I kept looking at that polished boot toe, and thinking how he'd shined it for a furlough he was so proud of, and how a mother somewhere had a kettle on for him that he was never going to come home to. And the fever took that thought and ran it around and around the inside of my skull until I was crying, which a man my age has no business doing in front of strangers, and which I blamed entirely on the heat in my blood and not at all on the boot. Itza stayed beside me. She'd made a place for herself there on the floor with her back to the bench, close enough to reach me, and every so often her hand would come to my forehead, flat and dry and cool, and stay there a moment, taking some reading off me only she knew how to read. She didn't say much. She'd learned, I think, that talk doesn't help a man in a fever, it just gives the fever more to twist. So she was quiet, and the quiet was the most comfort I'd had in years, and I want to set that down plain because so much of what passes for kindness in this world is noise, and hers wasn't. Hers was the kind of kindness that knows when to shut up. But fever is a liar, and somewhere in the deep of that night it loosened my tongue, and I started asking her things no man has the right to ask a woman he's known 6 hours. I don't remember all of it. I remember enough to be ashamed. I asked her where she learned to kill a man with a kitchen knife. She didn't answer for a long while. The lamp hissed. Outside, far off, a coyote said its piece and another one disagreed. And then, because I was dying, she must have figured, or because the dark makes confessors of us all, or because she'd been carrying it so long that a half-mad drover on a dirt floor seemed as good a place to set some of it down as any, she told me. Not all of it. Itza never told all of anything. She handed you pieces and trusted you to be smart enough or kind enough not to ask for the rest. But she told me enough that the rest I could build myself, lying there, watching the lamp grow its halo. She was Chiricahua, born in the Dragoon country, in the years when that country still belonged to her people, and everybody including the people knew it wasn't going to for much longer. I won't pretend to give you the history. I'm a drover, not a professor, and most of what I'd say I'd get wrong. But I know how it goes for a people that the bigger people have decided are in the way. I'd seen the leavings of it my whole working life. The burned rancherias nobody talked about. The wagon trains that went through scared and came back proud. The bounty notices in the territorial papers that priced a human scalp like a wolf pelt, and didn't ask too many questions about which it was when you brought it in. Itza had been a child for the first part and a woman for the rest, and somewhere between the two she had learned the single hardest lesson a person can learn, which is that no one is coming to help. Not the army who came but not to help. Not the agency who counted you for the rations and shorted you on the count. Not God, who she did not blame because she decided early that God had a great deal on his plate and a Chiricahua woman was a long way down the list. She'd learned to help herself. She'd learned it in a school I hope none of you ever have to attend, where the lessons are taught once and the failing grade is death. She had been married. I got that much. A man named, she said it once and I lost it to the fever, and I've always been sorry, because a name is a small thing to keep for somebody and I couldn't even keep that. He was killed. Not in a battle, the way a man would want to be remembered. Killed in the ugly small way that most killing actually happens, in the gray of a morning by men who'd come for the horses and didn't expect anybody to be up. She'd been up. She'd seen it. And she'd done the thing that I think broke something in her that never fully healed and forged something else that never broke after. She'd stayed hidden. She'd watched it happen from a place 6 feet away in the brush, with her hand over her own mouth, because to come out would have been to die beside him and accomplish nothing, and she had a child. That was the morally heavy thing, and she said it to me flat, no softening, staring at the lamp. I let them kill him so I could live for the child. I have never been sure I chose right. I didn't have anything to say to that. There isn't anything to say to that. A lesser man would have tried. You did what you had to, the kind of cheap coin people press into your hand at a funeral. But the fever, for once, did me a favor and kept me quiet. I just lay there and let her words be true in the room without trying to make them smaller. I think that was the right thing. I think it might be the only right thing I did that whole night. The child. Here is where the telling gets hard, and here is where I understood, lying on that floor, why a woman ends up on a broken-down stage with a paring knife already palmed before any trouble starts. The child had been taken. Not killed, taken. There was a thing being done in those years, you may have heard of it or you may have been spared, where the children of the people were gathered up and shipped east to schools, so-called, to have the Indian taken out of them, that being the phrase the good Christian men who ran it used without flinching. Kill the Indian, save the man. They put it in pamphlets. They were proud of it. They took the children on trains 1,000 miles to brick buildings in cold country, and cut their hair and forbade their tongue, and gave them new names out of the Bible. And some of those children lived, and some of them died of the strange diseases, and the strange food, and the plain killing grief of it. And a fair number of the ones who lived came home years later to a home that had moved on without them, strangers in both worlds, fitting nowhere. Itza's daughter had been taken in one of those gatherings while Itza was off. I never got the where of it, hunting work, hunting food, hunting something to keep them alive. And she had come back to an empty wickiup, and a neighbor too frightened to do more than point east. And so she went east. That's the part that took the wind out of me, fever or no. You have to understand the size of it. A Chiricahua woman, alone in those years, with the whole weight of the territory's hatred on her back, and a price that might or might not get paid on her scalp depending on the conscience of whoever caught her. And she pointed herself east toward a school she only half knew the name of, in a country she'd never seen, full of people who'd shoot her for sport, to get back one child out of the thousands they'd taken. The arithmetic of it was hopeless. She knew it was hopeless. She'd told herself the figure, and the figure was no, and she'd looked at the no and decided, the same flat way she decided I wasn't going to die, that the no was simply going to have to be wrong. The big wool coat, the man's coat, it was her husband's. She wore it east because a figure in a man's coat from a distance is just a figure, and a figure she could survive being. A woman alone she could not. She'd cut her hair shorter than a Chiricahua woman would ever wear it, and gone by a Spanish name at the way stations, Maria, I think, or Marisol. She gave Voss's wife one of those, and Voss's wife had hated her anyway, hated the Apache showing through the Spanish like a stain through a tablecloth. She'd palmed the paring knife not because she expected tuck. She'd palmed it because she palmed a knife in every room she could not be sure of, which by then was every room on earth. She'd been ready her whole life because her whole life had taught her that ready was the only thing standing between her and the brush where you watch the people you love die with your hand over your own mouth. I lay there and I thought about my own 44 years, the complaints I'd built them out of, Dryden paying late, beans for supper, snake shooting and saddle sores, and the general low-grade grievance that I'd somehow decided was a hard life. And here was a hard life, kneeling beside me with its cool, dry hand on my burning head, and it wasn't complaining about anything. It had just decided the no was going to be wrong, and was walking east into it one-way station at a time. The doctor came near 3 in the morning. I know the hour because the fever broke around then, and I came up clear for a stretch, the way you'll surface for a clean breath out of deep water, and I heard the horse before I saw the man, heard it blowing hard, run near to foundering, 12 miles of dark behind it. And then Voss was in the door, and behind him a small angry man in a nightshirt and a coat, with his bag, swearing about the cold and the distance and the hour, and not meaning a word of the swearing, the way doctors swear, to keep from feeling the thing they'd feel if they stopped. He was a good doctor for a territory doctor, which is to say he was sober and his hands were clean, and he'd seen enough gunshots to know which ones to fuss over and which ones to just clean and pack and leave to God and a strong constitution. Mine was the second kind, he decided, after a great deal of poking that I'd have killed him for if I'd had the strength. Through and through, no ball to dig, no big vessel hit, just a tired man's bad luck. He looked at the packing Itza had done and grunted, which from a doctor is high praise, and asked who'd done it. Voss started to say something. Itza didn't say anything, and I clear for that one stretch, and meaning to do at least one decent thing before the fever took me back down, I said, the Mexican woman, Marisol. Gave her the name she'd chosen. Gave the doctor no reason to look at her twice, or remember her face for a bounty notice, or wonder what an Apache was doing this far east in a dead man's coat. She caught it, the choosing of the name. She looked at me across the lamplight while the doctor was busy with his bag, and she gave me the smallest nod a person can give and still call it a nod, and I understood that I had, in some small fashion, paid back 1 penny of what I owed her. 1 penny against a debt the size of a mountain. But she took the penny. Pride didn't stop her taking it. That was another thing about her. She had no pride of the wasteful kind, the kind that won't accept help because accepting help is a kind of admission. She'd take any help that got her 1 mile farther east. She'd have taken it from the devil and said thank you in good Spanish. The doctor stitched the boy up too, which is a strange way to put it since the boy was past stitching. I mean, he laid him out proper, closed his eyes, found a letter in his breast pocket addressed to a woman in Ohio, and said he'd see it sent. He was gentle about it, gentler with the dead boy than he'd been with the living me. I've noticed that about good men in hard country. They hoard their gentleness and spend it where it can't be wasted, and there's nothing in this world it can't be wasted on quite so safely as the dead. Tuck they dragged out back, and didn't waste any gentleness on it all. And while all this was going on, while the station got slowly put back into the shape of a place where ordinary things happen, I lay in my corner sliding down into the fever again, and I watched Itza make a decision. The stage part was due in the morning. The wheel would be fixed by noon. By noon she could be back on the road east, 1 more way station behind her, the daughter 1 more day's travel closer. That was the plan she'd carried in like a stone in her shoe. That was the no she was making wrong. But there was me, a half-dead drover she had no reason on God's earth to care about, who'd shot the ceiling and got himself ruined and contributed exactly nothing to his own salvation. The doctor would go back to Sweetwater at first light. Voss had a station to run and a wife who prayed instead of nursing. Pell the drummer was worse than useless, all hands and thank yous and no spine. If I lived, somebody had to sit with the fever and keep the wound clean and make the broth and pour it down a man too weak to feed himself, for the better part of a week, maybe more. And every one of those days was a day she wasn't traveling east. Every one of those days was a day the daughter stayed lost. The arithmetic was simple and it was brutal and it ran exactly counter to the only thing she'd been living for. The right thing for her child was to climb on that stage at noon and never think about Eli Cobb again. I was a stranger. I was, if we're being honest, one of the same kind of stranger whose people had burned her world down. I had no claim on her. None. The math said go. I saw her sit with it. Near dawn, gray coming up dirty in the one window, the lamp guttering low. I was mostly under by then, but I had a thread of clear left, and I used it to watch her, because some part of me already knew this was a thing worth watching. She sat with her back to the bench, and her hands folded hard in her lap the way she folded them when she was holding something down, and she looked at the window, at the east coming up gray, at the road that went toward her daughter. And then she looked at me. I'd like to tell you she didn't hesitate. It'd make a better story. The truth is she hesitated a long time, and I loved her for the hesitating more than I'd have loved her for an easy yes, because the hesitating meant she knew exactly what it cost. A person who doesn't hesitate over a sacrifice like that hasn't understood it. She understood it. She sat in that gray dawn and weighed her own lost child against a stranger's life. And let me tell you, friends, that is not a scale any human being should ever be set down in front of. And she'd been set down in front of it twice now in one lifetime. Once in the brush with her hand over her mouth, and now here, on a dirt floor, with a paring knife washed clean and put back in the drawer. She got up. She went and found Voss. I heard her low voice in his, and I heard the word weak, and I heard him grumble, and I heard her not budge. And then she came back and knelt down by me and put that cool, dry hand on my head again, and I came up just enough to know what it meant, that she'd given a week of her daughter's lostness to a stranger, that she'd made the wrong choice for the right reasons or the right choice for the wrong ones, that even she wasn't sure which, the same as she'd never been sure about the brush. And I tried to say something. I tried to say, don't go, I'm not worth a single mile of it, because it was true, and I knew it was true. She put 2 fingers on my mouth, stopped the words. Be quiet, she said. You will not die from this. The same flat sentence as before, the same handed-down figure. Except this time I understood it for what it had been all along. Not a comfort and not a prophecy, but a vow. A thing she'd decided and would now spend whatever it cost to make true, even if the cost was a week of East, even if the cost was a mile she could never walk back. I shut up. I held on to her name. I went down into the fever, and the last thing I knew was her hand on my forehead and the gray light coming up dirty in the window, and the road outside going east without her on it. The stage left at noon. I heard the harness far off, half dreaming. It left without her. She stayed. I found out I was vain, for one. The first time Itza had to help me to the slop bucket out back, I'd rather have died, and I told her so, and she said, without any particular feeling, "You said that yesterday. You did not die. Lean on me." So I leaned on her. There's a humility you can only learn from being weak in front of somebody who has decided not to make you feel small about it, and I learned it that week at 44, a couple of decades late. I found out the body is a stubborn, hopeful thing. Mine wanted to live even when the rest of me was too tired to care whether it did. The fever broke for good on the third day and left me wrung out like a wash rag. But underneath the weakness there was this dumb animal will going about its business, knitting the torn parts, pinking up the gray flesh, and it's attended it like you tend a fire you needed to keep through a cold night. Not coddling it, not letting it roar, just feeding it exactly what it needed and no more. Broth, mostly. A bitter tea she made from something she'd had folded in a twist of cloth in her coat, that tasted like the underside of a creek rock, and that I'd have sworn did nothing, until the day I noticed the wound had stopped its angry weeping and gone quiet and clean. And I found out what a person sounds like when they're far from the thing they love, and trying not to count the days. She never spoke of the daughter again after that fevered night. Not once. But I'd wake from a doze and catch her at the window with her back to me, very still, looking east down the road the stage had taken, and I'd see her hand come up and touch the collar of that big wool coat, her husband's coat, the dead man's coat she traveled in, touch it the way you'd touch a letter in your pocket to make sure it's still there. Then she'd hear me stir, and the stillness would break, and she'd be Marisol again, brisk, bringing the broth. But I'd seen it. Every day she stayed for me was a day she stood at that window and paid for it. I tried to make it worth something. Couldn't do much, weak as I was, but I could talk, and she'd let me in the evenings when the work was done and there was nothing to do but wait out the dark. I told her about the horse country, the Picos, the way light comes down off the Guadalupes in the late day, all gold and forgiving. I made her laugh once. Just once that whole week, some fool story about a mule of Dryden's that had a religious objection to bridges, and her laugh was a startled, rusty thing, like a sound she'd put away somewhere and forgotten the shape of. She looked almost ashamed of it after. I didn't say anything, but I kept that laugh. I've still got it. It's filed in the same drawer as her name. The hunter came on the 6th day. I knew what he was before he was off his horse. You get so you can tell. A drover sits a horse like the horse is doing him a favor. A soldier sits one like it's government property. But a bounty man sits a horse like the horse is a tool he'd trade in a minute for a better one. And he came up the road at that flat ground-eating pace they keep. The pace of a man who's never in a hurry, because hurry is for people who might lose their quarry, and he never loses his. He was younger than Tuck had been, and cleaner and worse. Tuck had been a brute, an appetite with a scattergun. This one had a system. He had a ledger in his saddlebag, I'd learn, with names and prices in a neat clerk's hand, and he hunted men and women the way a careful merchant works a debt book, no passion in it, just collection. He had a long gun in a scabbard and a pistol worn high, and a face that had never once in its life been surprised by anything. And he came into Voss's station with his hat still on and his thumbs in his belt, and he said, "Pleasant as you please." Looking for a woman, Apache, travels in a man's coat, dark wool too big for her, goes by Mexican names, Maria, Marisol, worth $200 to the right party back in the territory, and I'm the right party. The room went the particular kind of quiet that means everybody in it is doing arithmetic. I was on the bench by then, propped up, getting my legs back under me an hour a day. Itza was at the stove. She didn't turn around. I watched the back of her go absolutely still. That stillness I'd first mistaken for meekness and now knew for what it was, the stillness of a creature that has heard the thing it has always been listening for. Her right hand, down at her side where the hunter couldn't see it, drifted toward the meal bench, toward the drawer, toward the little knives. And I understood, in a cold rush, that I was about to watch her decide whether to die. Because that's what it came down to, and she knew it before I did. She could fight. She'd killed Tuck, and Tuck had been twice this man's size. But Tuck had been a fool who walked in clothes, and this one would never walk in clothes. He'd stand across the room with a long gun and collect her like a debt, and she knew the difference. She'd measured it the second he came through the door the same way she measured everything. She could go for the knife and die proving she was dangerous. Or she could let him take her. $200, a slow trip back to the territory in irons, and at the end of it not even the dignity Tuck's victims got. Just the bounty man's neat ledger with a line drawn through her name and the daughter East forever, unreached, the no made true at last. Neither one of those got her daughter back. That's the thing she was reckoning, fast, with her hand near the drawer. Both roads ended with the daughter lost. She'd come all this way to make a hopeless no into a yes, and here was the no, walked right in the door wearing spurs and a pleasant face, and there was no version of the next 10 seconds that didn't end with it winning. Here is where the penny came due. I want to be careful telling this part, because I've heard men tell stories about themselves, and I know how the telling fattens a man up past his true size. So let me be plain about what I was. I was a half-heeled drover who could barely stand. I had no gun. Mine was still on the floor under the bench where I dropped it the night I shot the ceiling. Nobody'd thought to give it back to me, and I hadn't asked. I was no match for that hunter, and we both knew it. And there was not one single thing about my body that was any use to anybody. But I had a mouth, and I had a week of lying awake thinking about a woman at a window, and I had, God help me, I finally had a clear chance to do one decent thing on purpose instead of by accident, and a man doesn't get many of those. Most of the good I'd done in my life I'd done sideways, without meaning to, the way you'll do a kindness just because doing the unkind thing was more trouble. This was different. This I'd get to choose. So I lied. It's the simplest thing in the world to tell and the hardest thing I ever did. You're a week late and 100 miles wrong, I said. My voice came out worse than I wanted, weak, a sick man's voice. But maybe that helped. Maybe a sick man's voice sounds like a man too poorly to bother lying. A patchy woman in a man's coat, sure. She was through here. Came in on the morning stage the day I got shot. The hunter turned his flat eyes on me. That's so. That's so. And she went out on the noon stage 4 days back east. And if you kept your horse pointed the right direction instead of stopping to make speeches, you'd have her by now. I let some drover's contempt into it, the genuine article, easy to summon because I had a real and abiding contempt for his whole trade. They're a Mexican woman here. I jerked my chin toward the stove without looking, the way you'd indicate a thing too ordinary to be worth a glance. Voss's cook. Been here since spring. You want to drag the Dutchman's cook back to the territory. You take it up with the Dutchman, but she's no more Apache than my left boot, and you'll look a fool hauling her 400 miles to find it out. I felt the whole room not breathe. Voss give the old Dutchman this much. He was quicker than he looked. Voss said gruff, since spring. Ja, Marisol, good cook. And his wife, his praying, hateful wife who'd made Itza eat at the end of the bench, his wife who I'd have bet my string of horses would sell her out in a heartbeat. His wife said in her flat, accented English, not looking up from the mending in her lap, 6 months she is with us. Where else I get help out here? And there was such weary truth in the way she said it that even I half believed her. And I knew it for a lie because I'd watched her hate the woman she was now defending. I have thought about that since, why the wife lied. I never asked her. But I think a person can hate a stranger easy, hate them for the color of them or the strangeness of them, hate them safe and from a distance. and then watch that same stranger run a field hospital on their floor and stitch their broth and save a man's life over 6 days, and find the hate has quietly rotted out from under them and left nothing to stand on. I think the wife had spent her hate by then. I think she just didn't know it till the moment came to either keep hatting or tell a lie, and found she'd rather lie. The hunter stood there a long moment. He was not a stupid man. That was the danger of him. He looked at me, and he looked at Voss, and he looked at the wife's bent head, and he looked, last and longest, at the back of the woman at the stove who had not turned around, who was stirring a pot with her right hand and keeping her left near the drawer, who was, to his eye, just a cook too busy with supper to be interested in men's business. And I watched him weigh it. The neat merchant arithmetic. $200 said the back of her was his, but 400 miles of dragging the Dutchman's actual cook back to the territory said fool, said wasted week, said the live one's already 4 days east on a stage you could still catch. A man with no passion in his work doesn't gamble. He goes where the sure money is. And I just made the sure money point east. He decided. I saw him decide the same way I'd seen her decide, that flat closing of the face when the figure comes up final. East, he said, not a question, filing it. East, I agreed. 4 days back, hard rider might still close it. He looked at me one more second, and something almost like respect crossed his face. Not for me, for the lie, the way one professional tips his hat to another's clean work. And then he touched his hat brim, to Voss, to the wife, not to me, and walked out and got on his horse, and pointed it east at that flat ground-eating pace, after a woman who had never existed, down a road she'd never traveled. We listened to the hoofbeats go small. Nobody moved till they were gone past hearing, and then a few seconds more. Because you don't trust the silence right away with a man like that. He could have stopped just down the road and walked back quiet to catch us in our relief. But he didn't. He was a system, and the system said east, and east he went. Itza put down the spoon. She turned around. Her left hand came away from the drawer empty, and I saw that it was steady, that her hand hadn't shaken at all this time, not during, and I understood that there are some frights so deep they go past the shaking kind, and this had been one, and she'd held herself so still for so long that the shaking couldn't find a way out. Her face was the color of ash. But her eyes, when they found me on the bench, her eyes were doing the thing again, the soft by 1 degree thing, the first drop of ice giving up. She didn't thank me. I want that understood because it was the finest thing she could have done and she knew it. Thanking me would have made it a transaction. I save you. You save me. Debt squared. Strangers again. She didn't square it. She crossed the room and she stood in front of me and she looked at me for a long while, and then she reached out and she did something she had never done in the whole week of touching me to take my fever and tend my wound. She touched me the way you touch a person and not a patient. She put her hand flat against the side of my face, just for a moment, the way you'd hold the face of someone you were trying to memorize, someone you were about to not see again. Eli Cobb, she said. First time she ever said my whole name. She said it like she was filing it somewhere in a drawer of her own. You shot the ceiling. I did, I said. My voice had gone to pieces. You saved my life with your mouth since you are no use at all with your hands. And there it was again, the rusty, startled laugh, the second one I ever got out of her and the last, and her eyes were wet now, finally, after everything. Wet not from fright and not from grief, but from the simple, unbearable surprise of having been, once, helped by someone the world had assigned to be her enemy. I did not think any of you would do that, she said, quiet. I have been a long time among your people. I did not think any of you would do that for me. I didn't have anything. I'd used all my words on the hunter. I just put my own hand up over hers against my face and held it there a second, and she let me. She left on the next stage. There wasn't any keeping her, and I wouldn't have tried. She had 4 days to make up and a child at the end of the road, and every hour she'd spent on me was an hour she now had to outrun. The wound was clean. I could stand a full hour. The danger was past, or past enough. There was no reason on earth for her to stay and 1,000 miles of reason to go. She went at noon. Same hour the imaginary Apache woman had gone, 4 days before, on a stage that had never carried her. I made it out to the yard on my own 2 legs to see her off, leaning on Voss, and the Dutchman's wife came out too and pressed a parcel of food into Itza's hands and didn't meet her eye and went back inside. And that was the whole of their reconciliation, and I think it was enough for both of them. I gave Itza my navy Colt, dug it out from under the bench myself slow and cleaned it and pressed it on her, and she tried to refuse it, the only thing the whole week she ever tried to refuse, and I said, "You're no use with your hands either, going east alone with just a kitchen knife," and used her own joke against her, and she took it. She took it because it would get her 1 mile farther, and her pride was never the wasteful kind. She broke it open, checked the loads with hands that knew guns better than mine ever had, and slid it into the pocket of that big wool coat, and the weight of it pulled the coat down crooked on that side, the dead man's coat, now with a live man's gun in the pocket, and I have never in my life been so glad to be parted from a thing. She climbed up. The driver clucked to the team, and just before they pulled away she leaned down from the seat and said the last thing she ever said to me, and I have turned it over so many times in 20 years that I've worn it smooth, and I'm still not sure I've got the bottom of it. She said, "If I find her, I will tell her a white man once lied for her mother. She will not believe me." And then, the ghost of that rusty laugh, "I am not always sure I believe it." And the stage pulled out east, into the gold light coming down off country I'd never see, and I stood in the yard leaning on a Dutchman and watched it get small, watched the dust come up behind it and hang and settle, and I did not wave, because she didn't strike me as a woman you waved at, and I did not call out, because I'd already used my one good lie and had nothing true left big enough to say. I never saw her again. I want that plain, because stories like to give you the reunion, the years later meeting on a street in some town, the daughter grown and the circle closed. I don't have that for you. I have a stage getting small on an eastern road and a dead man's coat pulled crooked by the weight of my gun, and a name I've kept in a drawer for 20 years. I don't know if she found the girl. I've thought about it every day near enough, and I've made up 100 endings and believed each of them for an afternoon. Some days I'm sure she did, that she walked into some cold brick school in some cold country and stood in the yard in her dead husband's coat with my old Colt in the pocket and her hand steady, and that they handed the girl over because what else do you do when a woman like that decides the no is going to be wrong? Other days I know better. I know the size of that country and the smallness of one woman in it, and I know how those schools held what they took, and I know the arithmetic was always no, and on those days I have to set down whatever I'm holding, the way I told you at the start, because some thoughts you don't hold things during. But here's the thing I keep coming back to, the thing that's truer than whether she made it. She walked east anyway, knowing the figure was no, knowing it the whole way. That's the part that rearranged the furniture in me and never put it back. Not the knife and tuck, though I'll go to my grave seeing it. The walking east. Choosing the hopeless thing on purpose, every morning, one-way station at a time, because the alternative was to agree that the no was true, and she would not agree to that. She never once in her life agreed to that. People ask me, the few I've ever told, whether I was in love with her. I don't think it was that. I think it was bigger and stranger than that, and I don't have a clean word for it even now. The closest I can come is the word I gave you at the start, the one I don't spend cheap. Respect. The kind that rearranges a man, the kind you don't recover from. I'm 64 now. I quit the trail years back. I keep a few horses and I keep a tally book the way I always did, and on the last page of every tally book I've filled since that week, in the bottom corner where the numbers run out, I write one word that isn't a number and isn't anybody's business but mine. I write her name. She's somewhere east in my telling of it. The girl's beside her. The coat's been mended. The gun's still in the pocket and's never been needed again. I don't know that any of that's true. I write it anyway. She taught me how.